Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're looking at part 2 of the Discovery Institute's Science Uprising series. This is part of a series, so feel free to start with part 1. Today we will watch as they handwave away huge swaths of philosophy to create a false dichotomy between eliminative materialism and their specific interpretation of mind-body dualism. Oh yeah, and they completely misrepresent the work of Dr. Wilder Penfield, who was essentially the first guy to map out the brain and who did such a good job that we still use his maps largely unchanged today. So let's go!
But looking at this organ, one would not immediately guess that all of the richness of mental life, of intelligence, of categorization, of language, of planning, of emotion, could arise from the structure of this 3 pounds of flesh.
Your robot's made out of meat, which is what I'm going to try to convince you of today.
Okay, starting off strong by showing out-of-context clips from various lectures talking about how it appears unlikely that the brain would be the source of consciousness, and that we are robots made out of meat. Right off the bat, this looks like it is probably along the same lines as that quote that we always hear about Darwin, and how he says it looks like the eye couldn't possibly have evolved, where the creationist conveniently cuts out the following sentence where Darwin begins explaining exactly how we know the eye did in fact evolve. In the case of Steven Pinker, he then goes on to provide some of the supporting evidence for the idea that consciousness is contained within the brain.
We know that stimulating the brain with an electrical current while the brain is exposed during neurosurgery can lead the patient to have a vivid, lifelike experience, indistinguishable from reality. We also know that during the course of thought and perception, there are patterns of naturally occurring activity in the brain. We know that the brain is a chemical device, as we see from the effects on mood and alertness and the ability to produce hallucinations from taking psychoactive drugs. We know, as I mentioned before, that when part of the brain is damaged due to a stroke, a part of the person no longer functions. A person who has suffered a lesion in the brain may lose the ability to produce an articulate sentence, or to empathize with the feelings of others, or to recognize a face or object, or to make a concerted plan. We know that surgery, another physical manipulation, can affect the psyche, perhaps most dramatically in the famous split brain surgery administered as a treatment for epilepsy, in which the two cerebral hemispheres are separated by severing the corpus callosum, the band of fibers that connects them, which results in independent consciousnesses existing in each of the disconnected hemispheres, as if it were possible to bisect the soul with a knife. We have every reason to believe that the life and death of the body is coextensive with the life and death of the soul. That is, when the physiological activity of the brain ceases, the person goes out of existence. We have reason to believe this because, despite massive efforts, no one has been able to communicate with the souls of the dead, despite enormous efforts. We also know that the brain has a breathtaking complexity that is fully commensurate with the breathtaking complexity of human thought and experience. If we opened up the head and found that it was filled with a homogeneous spam-like substance, we would have reason to wonder how it could be physically possible for the neural substrate to support all of the wonders of human perception and thought. In fact, we know that the brain comprises some 100 billion neurons, or brain cells, interconnected by some 100 trillion connections, or synapses. If one were even to ponder the combinatorial combinations of neurons that are interconnected, one can see that in terms of sheer physical capability, there's plenty of room in the brain for the complexity that we see in human thought.
The Jerry Coyne clip is largely the same, with him stating his own position in a way that makes it look absurd before giving his presentation where he talks about why it is not absurd.
Robots made out of meat.
Don't show me that mushy keyboard and expect me to believe it was making the glorious mechanical keyboard sounds you were playing. It's already stretching my suspension of disbelief to show someone hacking into and assuming control of other computers using a Mac.
Intelligence, language, motion, 3 pounds of flesh.
Robots made meat.
Are you and I really robots?
Speaking pedantically, no. The definition of robot is a machine resembling a human being and being able to replicate certain human movements and functions automatically. So part of the definition of the word robot excludes humans from being robots, so we are, by definition, not robots. But of course you're going after the idea that everything that happens in our consciousness is the result of something in the material world, so let's see what else you say.
What you are, what I am, is 100 trillion little cellular robots. Robots.
And by pulling that specific clip of that talk out, you make it look like he's saying that this is all we are, when he was in fact pointing out that these cellular robots make up the gestalt that is the human experience.
What we are, what each of us is, what you are, what I am, is approximately 100 trillion little cellular robots. That's what we're made of. No other ingredients at all. We're just made of cells, about 100 trillion of them. Not a single one of those cells is conscious. Not a single one of those cells knows who you are or cares. Somehow, we have to explain how, when you put together teams, armies, battalions of hundreds of millions of little robotic, unconscious cells, not so different really from a bacterium, each one of them, the result is this. I mean, just look at it. The content, there's color, there's ideas, there's memories, there's history, and somehow all that content of consciousness is accomplished by the busy activity of those hordes of neurons. How is that possible?
And he freely admits in that talk that he does not give a very satisfying answer, but he does demonstrate rather conclusively that a large part of everything that we think we see is just our brain filling in what it thinks should be there.
That may sound scientific, but is it? I spoke with Dr. Michael Egnor, a human brain expert.
Yes, you spoke to a neurosurgeon, which could be called a brain expert. But you used the vague phrase brain expert instead of the specific phrase neurosurgeon, and I suspect that the reason for that is that you're about to get him to talk about philosophy rather than neurology. Philosophy is a brain thing, right? So surely someone who knows about neurology will also know philosophy, right?
And eliminative materialism is an ideological viewpoint, a philosophical viewpoint.
Philosophical, yes. Not sure about ideological, but it is a controversial philosophical viewpoint to be sure.
But it's not a scientific viewpoint. It is the viewpoint that there is no such thing as the mind.
Well, that depends entirely on which sub-branch of eliminative materialism you find yourself in. Now, I'm not going to try to pretend to understand the whole position of eliminative materialism here. I'm not a philosopher, and quite frankly, my eyes start to glaze over when I start reading philosophy. I am well aware that the philosophy of science is important to the scientific process, and that metacognition, that is, thinking about thinking, is an important part of day-to-day living for anyone who wants to do as Matt Dillahunty says, and believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. So to give a brief overview of my understanding of eliminative materialism, it basically boils down to the idea that either there are no mental states, just brain states, or that there really are mental states, but that the mental states themselves are brain states. I'm not entirely sure what the distinction between these two positions is, and I don't really feel like reading the entire entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on it, as it is rather long and dense. So let me just throw out this whole part of the conversation by pointing out that not all atheists are eliminative materialists. In fact, the encyclopedia entry seemed to go out of its way in pointing out that it is a minority opinion. The question of whether or not mental states are separate from brain states ultimately doesn't matter much when it comes to the question of whether or not there is a god. And on top of it all, you're presenting it as a false dichotomy. There are many more than just two philosophical positions regarding our sense of consciousness and self, and it is far from a settled matter. If you want a deep dive on that subject, I will leave a link to the Partially Examined Life podcast where they spend 2 one-hour episodes talking about the problem of consciousness down below.
It's not that the mind is explainable by matter, it's just that the mind doesn't exist at all. It exists at all.
And if that were an accurate summation of eliminative materialism, then I would disagree. I would suggest that the mind does exist and is the result of material interactions. You're doing that thing again where you find something that most people will disagree with and then act as though their disagreement with you on larger issues like evolution automatically lumps them into a position like this that they also disagree with.
The one thing almost everyone accepts is that we actually exist.
Yep, I can agree with you that I do in fact exist. But I also recognize that this is ultimately not something that I can empirically demonstrate to be true.
We're persons, not just a collection of body parts. We have a self, an inescapable I.
Yeah, it seems that way. Depending on whether or not it turns out we have free will, the sense of self might just be a powerful illusion, but I certainly do seem to be me, at least to me.
I have a brain, but I am not a brain. I feel emotions, but I am not an emotion. I think thoughts, but I am not a thought.
No, I am not a brain, but my brain is me. I am not an emotion, I am not a thought, I am a collection of thoughts, memories, and emotions contained in a brain. And I just had a mini existential crisis as I made the connection that who I am is essentially a collection of memories and emotions associated with those memories, and that our brains are terrible at accurately recording memories. And that's probably the result you're going for. You just want me to have a negative association with the idea of materialism, so that will give me a more favorable disposition when considering your alternative. Well done, that's some grade A manipulation there. But as I spent most of part 1 pointing out, whether or not I like something has no bearing on the truth of that thing.
Who are you? Think about it. Who am I?
Who am I? 24601!
Most people feel they're more than their physical bodies.
And if we feel like it's true, then it must be true. Get into the science of it already, will you?
What materialists don't tell you is this feeling is actually supported by science. Recent research has revealed fresh evidence for an immaterial mind, where thoughts actually change your brain.
Okay, so what's actually going on here is...
Yes, I'm amped. Let's do this.
Shannon? Aren't you supposed to be lurking on YouTube waiting for new videos to go up so that you can comment first?
I'm multitasking, bud. I'm amazing at it. I've probably already commented first on this video, and I'm not even done recording. I really hope that you didn't think that you were going to do a video about neuroscience and the philosophy of mind without me showing up. Seriously, I am essentially the internet. There's not even anything that you could do about it. Let's go!
Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz treats people who suffer from obsessive-compulsive disorder. His treatments provide evidence that thoughts can change our physical brains.
By training people, literally training them to reinterpret the feelings that you need to check or that something is dirty, reinterpret it as a false message from your brain. People could, in fact, learn how to understand that this is not me, this is a false message from my brain, and when they did that, their OCD improved and their brain changed. That's the part where you really get the leverage to say you're not just your brain, because choices you make can actually change how your brain works.
This research clearly supports mind over matter. Mind over matter.
Okay, so there are some issues here, primarily with the presentation. I'm about to geek out for a bit, so grab a drink because this stuff's awesome. I'll get to the issues after I'm done telling you about how wicked brains are. Because they're talking about OCD, let's stick to OCD as we're talking about brain plasticity and focus on just one cortical region to make it simple. We don't know the exact cause, but there is some research that tells us that in people who are suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, we see some abnormalities in their orbital frontal cortex, which sits at the base of the front of your brain right above your eye sockets. That part of your brain has pretty strong connections to functions involving emotion and memory. So, kind of makes sense. Now, here is where the theories regarding how and why directed cognitive behavioral type therapies, like the kind that Dr. Schwartz is talking about, get really interesting. This is one I like that's pretty fascinating. Your brain has a complex interconnected infrastructure. Multiple parts interact seemingly simultaneously to do something as simple as picking up a pen off of your desk. You have to have a desire for the pen, an intention to get it, an awareness of where it is, and an awareness of how to move your body to retrieve it, and even a concept of what that pen is for. Our brains have a clear localization of function for multiple things. However, they can adapt, and how these infrastructures operate in conjunction with one another plays a really important role in that. Now, in behavioral therapies, we preempt an expected outcome based on stimulus exposure. We know, for example, that in some patients with OCD, they might have severe irrational averse reactions to dirt. When you expose them to dirt and nothing catastrophic happens, that can have the effect of lowering future anxiety. When you simultaneously direct them to understand that it's irrational, provide them with explanations as to why, help them understand and attribute that reaction to the actual neurological causes instead of the proximal stimuli, etc., you can rebuild those pathways in the orbital frontal cortex that weren't operating correctly before. The constitution and the physiology of your brain that generates that effect can change because you're retraining multiple areas involved in that action and reaction. But this isn't necessarily or even likely because your mind as an innocuous, amorphous concept is affecting your physiology. It's because you're being directed and coached into reinterpreting external perceptions and better understanding them. Perceptual cognition is in many measurable ways a physical act. Our thoughts are intangible concepts, but their physiological correlates are undeniable. And this is where we get to them really annoying me. They say his research provides evidence that your mind changes your brain. This couldn't be more watered down to prove their point. This can give people the perception that they can essentially think their way into physiological changes in their neuroanatomy. It ignores and admits that there is a specific set of guiding circumstances continuously necessary and external to the person in order for the desired effect to even be possible. It's fascinating, and there are legions of theories built around how it works, but directed therapies qualify as external stimulus in my books. Not to mention, the argument itself recognizes that in order for the therapy to be effective at all, it has to result in a physiological change to neuroanatomy. Physiological. The structure and function of the physical components of your brain matter. If they didn't, this argument wouldn't make any goddamn sense to begin with. Your brain would just stay the same, and you could simply change your mind and get better.
Further evidence for an immaterial mind comes from an operation known as a corpus callosotomy.
Does it, though? Do you guys remember back at the beginning of the video where I played a bit more of the Steven Pinker clip that they took out of context? Do you remember what was on the list of evidence for the idea that our brains determine who we are? Surgery, that's what. And it was this particular operation that he was referring to. So let's see how this can be evidence both for and against the material mind.
In this operation, you literally cut the brain in half by severing the corpus callosum.
I mean, not quite. There are other areas of the brain that connect the two hemispheres, such as the thalamus, but let's see where you're going.
It's an operation that I've performed, and their brains were essentially cut in half. But they still seem to be a unitary person. They still seem to be fairly normal. And what that implies is that the human mind is not purely generated by the matter of the brain. Otherwise, cutting the brain in half would have profound effects on the human mind. It might make two people.
Yeah, and it has been known to pretty much do just that. I see why you didn't include that bit of Pinker's talk where he points out that fact, but I also rather like the experiment where they had subjects who had undergone the corpus callosotomy look at a screen that projected two images in such a way that the left hemisphere would receive one image and the right hemisphere would receive the other one. The two images were of a chicken foot and a winter scene. The subjects were then asked to point at flashcards that were related to the images they had seen. They pointed at the chicken with their right hand and to a snow shovel with their left. When asked why they chose these particular images, they were able to explain why they chose the chicken for their right hand, but when asked about the snow shovel, they would explain that the shovel is used to clean out the chicken coop. It's almost like the side of the brain that saw the winter scene contained a separate person from the one that saw the chicken, but because language is handled by the left side of the brain in most people, the image seen by the right side of the brain has no way of communicating why it chose the flashcard that it did, so the left side makes up a plausible answer given the known inputs.
Certainly, it would create a rather profound difference in a person's state of consciousness, and it doesn't.
Doesn't it? There have been other experiments like the chicken and snow experiment, all of which show that while it is possible for the patients to live relatively normal lives, there are profound differences in the way they perceive the world around them and express their desires and intentions. Now, normally they won't be in a lab setting where one side of the brain is restricted from seeing something that the other side has access to, so it won't come up. But there are instances where both sides of the brain disagree on an action to be taken, and the corresponding sides of the body take contradictory actions. For instance, a common effect will be when a person decides to get dressed. One hand will try to put their pants on, while the other tries to take them off because that side of the brain didn't decide to get dressed. It seems to me like you're ignoring any research that might suggest a conclusion that you don't like.
A third piece of evidence for an immaterial mind comes from brain stimulation experiments that seem to show our intellect and identity are not found in our brain tissue.
I am not aware of any electrical stimulation experiments that had those results. I'm not saying they don't exist, they very well might and I just haven't found them, but not being able to alter the sense of self with electrodes when the experimenters aren't even trying to do that does not mean that the sense of self does not reside in the brain. The fact of the matter is that this is not a completely settled issue. Yes, scientists who hold to materialism tend to be of the opinion that consciousness itself is a function of the brain, and I share that opinion, but there is much discussion on the matter with many different philosophical opinions.
Some of the most famous of these experiments were conducted by brain surgeon Wilder Penfield.
I'm not sure which experiments of his you're claiming have demonstrated that our intellect and identity are not contained in the brain. He pretty conclusively demonstrated that external stimulation of the brain can induce vivid hallucinations, including reliving past memories and out-of-body experiences. I might be wrong here, and I'm sure there are differing philosophical opinions, but it seems to me that altering your sense of identity to make you feel like you are outside of your own body indicates that your sense of identity can be changed by stimulating the brain, which to me suggests that your sense of identity is contained within the brain.
He was a meticulous scientist. He repeatedly observed that there were aspects of the patient's mind that no matter what he did to the brain, he couldn't affect. He could elicit memories by stimulating a part of the brain. He could make a muscle move or make a patient have a sensation, but he couldn't change their consciousness. He couldn't change their intellect.
I'm having a hard time finding anything that suggests that changing intellect was a goal of any of his experiments. As far as changing consciousness goes, doesn't inducing fully immersive hallucinations count as altering the consciousness? I'll also take this moment to point out that Dr. Penfield was born American, but moved to Canada and became a Canadian citizen. Neener boo boo, we got the good neurosurgeon.
He couldn't change their sense of self, that no matter what he did to the brain, remained the same.
Again, though, I'm not finding anything to suggest that he was trying to change their sense of self, unless you count out-of-body experiences. But if you mean altering your perception of who you are, it seems like that would be the kind of experiment that wouldn't pass an ethics board. How would you feel if you were a test subject being asked to go into an experiment where the doctor was going to poke around your brain in an attempt to alter your perception of who you are as a person? Now, to be fair, I don't think ethical review boards were really a thing when he was working, but I'm not seeing anything to suggest that his work was at all controversial in any way, and trying to alter someone's sense of self strikes me as something that would be controversial.
A fourth piece of evidence for an immaterial mind comes from experiments about free will. Materialists try to convince us that free will does not exist.
I hope to convince you that free will is an illusion. Free will is an illusion.
So we go from talking about what counts as the sense of self to the question of free...
Yes! Philosophy of mind.
You again?
Oh my gosh, you get to talk about the coolest stuff when people make assertions about God being the cause of mental states, neuroanatomical changes, and self-awareness. I am having way too much fun. This shouldn't be this much fun.
But Dr. Benjamin Leibott's experiments show that humans do have free will. At least the free will to say no.
About perhaps half a second before you decide to do something, there's a spike in your brain that he called the readiness potential. It's almost like an unconscious motive.
Since they really didn't bother explaining exactly what the Leibott experiments were, let me help to clarify a little. Leibott had participants perform self-directed physical tasks involving wrist movements while looking at a clock and attached to an EEG. The participants were asked to note the position on the clock at the precise moment they decided to enact the movement. There was a consistent uniformity across groups that showed a clear spike in electrical activity in the brain regions associated with bilateral movement about 300 milliseconds prior to the participants reporting awareness of that intention. These experiments have been repeated with more sophisticated measuring equipment, and the results remain consistent. So at this point, it's a well-established fact. But what does that mean? Well, it means that prior to you being aware that you're going to do something, you were already about to do it. It's happening with or without you, which is pretty cool. But it raised a lot of questions about exactly what we mean by free will and whether or not it's even possible based on what we know about cognition and awareness.
Materialists have used this readiness potential to suggest that we are misled into thinking we have free will.
Free will is an illusion.
That our material brain just sort of makes the decision. and we kind of think that we decided, but we didn't.
From a philosophical perspective, that would be primarily determinist, but this isn't really about the philosophy. The philosophy is a way that we attempt to explain the phenomena that we reliably observe and reconcile it to our ideas about what free will even is and whether it's even possible. Regardless of the philosophy, there are facts here about cognition and mental states that aren't easily reconciled.
Leibniz didn't agree with that. He asked the subjects to do something more. He said, when you decide to do something, then decide not to. When they did that, he found that there was a readiness potential for deciding to push the button. But there wasn't a readiness potential to decide not to push it. And he said, he didn't prove the existence of free will, but he proved the existence of free won't. And that's what he called it, free won't. That in a sense we have motives that are beyond our control. We can't stop the motives, but we can stop ourselves from doing it.
This is where neuroscience and the philosophy of mind collide in an amazing and fascinating way. Leibniz called this the conscious veto. Leibniz did an experiment specifically to try to prove the conscious veto was possible. This time, instead of asking people to move whenever they like and clock their intention to do so, he asked them to intend to move their wrist at a specific interval and note the point when they were aware of the decision, but then not do it, while an EEG was still monitoring their neural activity. You could see a very specific and consistent drop in the neural activity, and this would indicate that you can intercede in the plan the brain was setting in motion. Those who were more than a little bit vexed about the implication of the first study looked at the second study and said, "Ha-ha! See, we can control our minds. We can interject and subdue the will." But can you? In order for that to be the case, truly, the participant would have to have had the spontaneous intention to make the movement, and of their own volition, have spontaneously decided not to before they could enact the behavior. Do you see the issue here? I'm not certain I can explain it as well as a philosopher, so I'll let Alfred Mealy do it for me.
And what he discovered is that you got an EEG reading that looked like a longer tailed, it's called a type 1 readiness potential, type 1 RP, until about 150 to 250 milliseconds before the designated time, and then the ramp petered out. And Libet said, hey, look, that's evidence of veto power, because they've got this intention to flex when the spot hits there, and then they veto it, and when they veto it, you get this petering out in the EEG. Now, the veto power is supposed to be the power to veto an intention. So this little argument of Libet's is going to work only if those people, given that instruction, intended to flex when the spot hit there. And remember, the instruction was prepare to flex when the spot hits there, but don't do it. So now I could give you an argument, but instead we're going to do our own little experiment. So here it is, okay, and you'll see the connection. So what I'd like you to do, I'd really like you to do this, is to prepare to snap your fingers when I get to 3, and I'm going to count 1, 2, 3. Prepare to do it, but don't do it, okay? All right, so here we go. All ready? So you're going to prepare to do it when I get to 3, but you're not going to do it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, how many of you intended to snap your fingers when I got to 3? All right, there we go. End of that one.
Materialist scientists mostly ignore this evidence because it doesn't support their worldview.
To the vast majority of scientists, the question of free will does not affect their work in any way whatsoever. If I'm studying the detection of oceans on exoplanets by polarization colors, then whether or not I have free will when I do so is irrelevant to the actual research. So Luca Maltagliati, who recently published a paper in Nature Astronomy about just that subject, can be completely forgiven for not considering free will in his paper.
You are cellular robots.
Materialists are realists, in a sense. They understand that materialism cannot explain the mind.
A materialist understands that current science does not have an adequate explanation for the mind. That doesn't mean it will always be this way, but if there is actual evidence to support a different hypothesis about the mind, then we are open to that evidence-based hypothesis. But at the moment, it is simply filling in the gap with guesswork. I guess that the mind is something that can be explained in terms of science and materialism. You guess that it is not. Neither of us has conclusive research on our side, but one of us does have precedent.
Rather than abandoning materialism, they abandon the mind.
Only in one branch of a sub-branch of materialist philosophy that, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is a minority opinion. There's your false dichotomy again.
Neuroscience shows that you are more than your brain.
You haven't actually shown any of that neuroscience, though. You've just shown a lack of positive results in experiments that, as far as I can tell, weren't even attempted. And you've painted the philosophy around the idea of consciousness and a sense of self as a black and white choice between an extremely specific and minority position of eliminative materialism, and agreeing with your position that seems to be that the brain is an antenna which is used to communicate with some disembodied mind that is you. But you have not provided any evidence for this disembodied mind aside from pure speculation.
This liberating evidence frees us to think rationally about who we really are: body, soul, and mind.
Body and mind, sure. Soul? Again, you have not provided any evidence. You've just filled in a gap in our scientific knowledge with this idea of the soul. And if our mind is some disembodied consciousness that uses our brain as an interface, then what is the soul? Is there a difference between the mind and soul?
We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority.
We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
Well, that does it for Episode 2. Episode 3 is called DNA is Code. Who coded it? So it looks like I'll be getting back to familiar territory with that one. Huge thanks to Shannon Q for her help on this one. My brain might have melted if I had to do it on my own. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Stephen LeBlanc. Sorry, Stephen, I'm not going to read most of your comment. I pretty much agree with it, but I want to address the bit about the moth. So Stephen says, the moth example is bad. Predicting a moth from a particular flower is equally possible from evolution or creationism. This is referring to the fact that Darwin predicted the existence of a moth with a 30-centimeter proboscis from the observed existence of an orchid with a 30-centimeter spur on the island of Madagascar. Alfred Russel Wallace then narrowed the prediction down to not just any old moth, but a sphinx moth. Decades later, a sphinx moth with a 30-centimeter proboscis was found on the island of Madagascar. From an evolutionary perspective, this fits. A moth with a longer proboscis can get food easier, but it won't pollinate the flower as well, so a flower with a longer spur is more likely to reproduce with the help of these well-endowed moths. So over evolutionary time, the proboscis of the moth and the spur of the flower are lengthened to ridiculous proportions. This is an excellent example of the predictive power of evolution. But surely this would also hold true for creationism, right? If God created a flower with a 30-centimeter spur, surely he would also have created a pollinator for it, right? Maybe, but it wouldn't have had to have been a moth. It could have been an entirely new creature that we had never seen before. With the moth, it makes very little sense. Why would God make both the flower and the moth waste resources building parts of their bodies to these ridiculous lengths when shorter ones would do just as well? If creationism were true, then there are any number of reasons God could have created a flower with a long spur, and any number of potential pollinators that would be compatible with that flower. There is no reason that God should have had to stick with the moths that pollinate other orchids. So as usual, creationism leaves us with no predictive power, while evolution has powerful predictive capabilities. Special thanks to this week's PayPal heroes, Massimo Giordani, Paul Prachun, and Kevin Dayton, who have made it possible for me to continue my Earl Grey tea addiction for at least one more week. As always, links to sources, Amazon wishlist, social media, and ways to financially support the channel are in the description, as well as my P.O. Box address. Thanks for watching, and see you next time!